Good afternoon and good morning to you, wherever you may be. My name is Duncan Harris, the President of the Australia-Africa Chamber of Commerce. I'm delighted on behalf of the AACC and Austrade to welcome you today to Webinar 3 of our Africa Calling series. Before we get underway, I've got, of course, two housekeeping matters to draw to your attention. We are recording this session. It'll be available to our members as a follow-up on the AACC and Austrade website channels shortly. We'll also be having a question and answer session, which is your opportunity to ask questions of our presenters. If you've not already done so, in the course of this session, submit them through the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Our topic today is Meet the Ambassadors and High Commissioners. In the first two webinars of this series, How to Succeed in Africa and How to Navigate the Corporate Map in Africa, we sought to demonstrate the merits of the partnership we've forged with Austrade and to provide an example of the roadmap to meaningful pathways to on-ground contacts and connections to facilitate such business. 12 months ago, we hosted, in collaboration with Austrade, Export Finance Australia and DFAT, the Why Africa National Seminar Roadshow Series in Perth, Adelaide, Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne to brief Australian companies on the great scope and opportunity for bilateral trade with Africa. Today, we're delighted to be presenting in digital form the first of our two-part series in which three of our Africa-based ambassadors and high commissioners will provide you with update reports on their posts. Ian Halliday, Australia's Consul General Dubai and General Manager Austrade for the Middle East and Africa, and as such, my counterpart, will shortly introduce each of you. But before he does, I am particularly pleased that we're able to have our Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment, Senator the Honourable Simon Birmingham, join us for some introductory remarks. Welcome, Minister.
Welcome to Africa Calling, a series of webinars hosted by Austrade, the Australian Trade and Investment Commission, and the Australia-Africa Chamber of Commerce. Thank you, Duncan and the Australia-Africa Chamber of Commerce, for this invitation to join the webinar series. Australia and Africa have built strong bilateral trade and investment and people-to-people ties over many years now, and I see enormous potential for expanding and deepening those relationships. Sadly, right now COVID-19 makes it difficult to meet in person, but these webinars can foster meaningful engagement, unlock new doors to exciting trade or investment opportunities, and help better prepare all of us to bounce back as strongly as we can from this pandemic. We want these webinars to be a forum for the exchange of information and ideas, a source of valuable insights for businesses looking to establish themselves across the African continent, and for African companies looking for opportunities right here in Australia. The scale of opportunity in Africa is significant and growing. In 2018, Australia's two-way goods and services trade with Africa was valued at $11.4 billion. With Africa's population of 1.2 billion people expected on some estimates to double by 2050, the opportunities for growth are enormous. African countries are also taking steps towards integrating into a single market under the African Continental Free Trade Area. This initiative is hoping to establish a single market with a cumulative GDP of over 3.4 Australian trillion dollars across 55 member states of the African Union. The continent's growing middle classes are eager to take advantage of quality education and health services, and to take advantage of e-commerce, all areas where Australia can further contribute to the development of many African nations. Of course, mining is an area that has been a cornerstone of the Africa-Australia relationship for many years, with 168 ASX-listed companies operating across at least 31 different African countries, increasingly providing the know-how and services to generate growth, economic opportunities, jobs and more prosperity in those countries. International education is another sector so important to Australia and to growing capacity and capability across other countries. In the 2019 calendar year, the South Saharan region provided about 44,000 students, mainly across the higher education and vocational education and training sectors, to Australian institutions, each of them leaving better skilled, better able to contribute to growth and prosperity across their home countries. We're also seeing significant new opportunities in agriculture and food security, power generation, medtech and agri-tech, construction and services. One exciting example of Australian capability matching the needs of Africa for growth is Geoscience Australia's Digital Earth Africa, which provides satellite data assisting food security and water management. Australia's network of ambassadors, high commissioners and trade commissioners work hand in hand across the African region to provide assistance to businesses and investors. We have 9 embassies and high commissions in Africa, with the most recent expansion to the network occurring with the establishment of an embassy in Morocco by our government in 2017. There are also 3 Austrade offices, as well as Austrade coordination provided from Dubai. It is very much a Team Australia approach, and they are there to serve and work alongside you, businesses seeking to grow and expand the relationship. Our government wants to ensure that Australian businesses are well placed to take advantage of the developments and opportunities that arise. So it is so pleasing to see that the AACC is reaching out not only to Austrade, to the ambassadors and high commissioners and their teams, but building this partnership across businesses, ensuring that we harness the knowledge and respect of all of the resources that can help to achieve growth in the relationship. The Africa Calling webinar series is another great example of our commitment to strengthen this mutually beneficial partnership and create new opportunities for Australian businesses. I commend this program to you. I hope that it's not too long before we all have the opportunity to meet again in person, and I trust that you all enjoy great success as you seek to deepen the Australia-Africa relationship and to create new opportunities to drive prosperity across all of our countries. Thanks very much.
Well, good afternoon and good morning, everyone, and thanks very much for joining us today. And I'd just like to pass on special thanks to Minister Birmingham for his video contribution. Wonderful words of wisdom, encouragement and support to continue to develop the diplomatic, trade, investment and economic relationships between Australia and Africa. And as the Minister suggested, we want these webinars organised and co-hosted by AACC and Austrade really to be a forum for the exchange of information, ideas and a source of valuable insights for businesses looking to establish themselves or even build their presence across the African continent, and for African companies looking for opportunities in Australia. It's a real pleasure for Duncan and the AACC and the Austrade team to warmly welcome today the Australian ambassadors and high commissioners for today, the first of 2 webinars. Today we'll hear from 3 of our excellencies and next week another 4. I can't speak highly enough of the work that our high commissioners and ambassadors do across the globe and, more importantly, across the African continent. Our excellencies are the most senior Australian diplomats and representatives in their countries of accreditation. They not only support and assist and look after Australian citizens, they are integral in the ongoing development of diplomatic, trade and economic relationships in many countries in Africa. They are invaluable in looking for and assisting Australian businesses realise opportunities. They assist with both developing and nurturing government-to-government relationships, but also importantly, government-to-business relationships. And they can open doors and remove impediments for both trading businesses as well as investors. They are truly wonderful ambassadors for Australia and its people and businesses. But as the Minister said in his remarks, it is also very much a Team Australia approach. And the ambassadors and high commissioners work very closely with the Austrade team, who also we have a strong presence in the region in 5 different posts. And we are truly delighted with our partnership with the AACC, another valued partner, and truly operate in a Team Australia approach with our ambassadors, high commissioners and the Austrade team, assisting companies who want to enter into the market or grow their business. I've only been in this role for just on 2 years, and I think that I can certainly attest to this from a personal perspective, but sometimes business people don't really consider reaching out to DFAT, Austrade, and now the AACC for help and support. And when I was in the commercial sector, I rarely did. But since coming into my current role, I've really found how valuable it is and the resources that are available, whether that be the Australian government and the various business councils and chambers, to be supporting commercial entities. And my recommendation, and Minister echoed this as well, is harness the knowledge, the linkages, the insights and the networks available to improve outcomes and help realise the wonderful opportunities that we all know are in front of us. And to the Minister's remarks, it's more than just mining and resources and METS and education. We see opportunities in food and agri-tech, in infrastructure, financial services, health services, alternative energy, just to name a few. And so between the High Commissioners and the Ambassadors and their team, the Austrade team, AACC, please reach out to us if you're looking for help and support, because we're only too happy to provide that. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our first High Commissioner today. And I'd like to introduce Her Excellency Ms. Geeta Kumar, who is the High Commissioner to South Africa. Geeta started in her post in South Africa mid-2019, and prior to that was the Assistant Secretary in DFAT in Canberra for the African branch. So brings a wealth of knowledge about Africa, and it gives me great pleasure now to introduce Her Excellency Geeta Kumar. Thank you, Geeta.
Thanks very much, Ian, and thank you, Duncan and the AACC and Austrade for organising this Africa Calling webinar series today. I'm very pleased to be able to participate, albeit virtually from Pretoria. When I presented my credentials to President Ramaphosa in late last year, in my short discussion with him, I focused on our solid and growing economic relationship. The Minister mentioned Australia's trade with Africa, and our trade with South Africa represents 1/3 of that total trade. We also have a very strong and growing investment relationship. We're the 7th largest foreign country investor in South Africa. And the relationship grew 11% last year to over 14 billion Australian dollars, which is equivalent to 165 billion rand. So it's a relatively balanced relationship with investment flows in both directions. And surprisingly, it's larger than many of Australia's investment relationships with countries closer to home in Asia. So when you look at FDI from South Africa into Australia, that's either on par with or larger than some of the FDI flows into Australia from countries like Indonesia and Vietnam. The relationship is dominated by mining and extractives, and we remain the single largest foreign country investor in South Africa's mining sector, with significant investments by companies such as Rio Tinto and South32. Junior miners are also making their mark. So a good example is Orion Minerals, which is dual listed on the JSE and the ASX, which recently obtained mining and water rights for its copper zinc mine in the Northern Cape province. But the relationship is much broader than mining. We have Australian household names like Cotton On, Telstra, Macquarie Bank, and Flight Centre, which all have operations in South Africa. In the renewable energy sector, Worley has facilitated the construction of the largest solar plant in South Africa, and Canberra-based WindLab has multiple wind farms in the Western and Eastern Cape provinces. And of course, prior to COVID, we had Qantas flying daily direct flights from Sydney to Johannesburg, and that coupled with the SAA direct flight from Perth to Johannesburg are the only 2 direct flights from Australia into mainland Africa, at least prior to COVID, and we're looking forward to Qantas resuming its flights next year. So it's a balanced economic relationship, and on the South African side we have household names with significant investments in Australia. I might just list a few. We have Woolworths Holdings that owns David Jones, Outsurance that owns the Youi Insurance Group, Growth Point Properties that has investments across commercial property in Australia and in fact owns the DFAT RG Casey building in Canberra, Sea Harvest, which operates fishing trawlers in Western Australia, Murray & Roberts, which owns Clough, which is contracted to develop the Snowy 2.0 project, and the Foschini Group, which owns over 500 stores such as YD and Tarocash in Australia and employs thousands of Australians. I was recently speaking to the CEO of Foschini. He tells me that they're in the top 500 companies paying tax in Australia. I think that a sizable proportion of the growth in the economic relationship is driven by the growing people-to-people links between our 2 countries. And South Africans are now the 7th largest migrant group in Australia. So these ties form a network of expertise, skills and cultural understanding, which can improve awareness of the relationship and how to harness the opportunities. We have very good cooperation on science and technology. South Africa and Australia are both jointly hosting the Square Kilometre Array, which will be the world's largest telescope, radio telescope. And of course, we're both located on the Indian Ocean. And in a recent study commissioned by DFAT, we were both identified as gateways for trade in the Indian Ocean region. We have a very active bilateral business chamber called the Australian Business Chamber of Commerce Southern Africa. It's based in Johannesburg. It's been established about 5 years ago. The executive is going through a refresh at the moment with a new chair coming into place soon. And when that occurs, I'd like to organise a joint session of the executive teams of both chambers, the AACC and the ABCSA, to see what further we can do to work together and facilitate COVID-19 economic recovery activities. Which brings me to COVID. Our initial and immediate focus at the High Commission when COVID hit was to facilitate the repatriation to Australia from South Africa and neighbouring countries of more than 800 Australians due to the lockdown and closing of airports. This process has now slowed, but there are still many people who want to return to Australia, and it's not clear when normal international flights will resume. And as is the case in Australia, South Africans are also looking forward to the opening of the borders here and the commencement of international flights, as the tourism market is integral to both countries. And in fact, Australians are the 7th largest source of tourists into South Africa outside of the African continent. Just in terms of the economy, South Africa was unfortunately already in recession when COVID hit, and it's now really taken a battering because of COVID. In fact, just yesterday, the Stats SA released the GDP figures for the second quarter and described it as a punch in the gut because the economy has contracted by more than 50% on a seasonal annualised basis, which is an unprecedented decline. It's been a broad-based collapse. The only sector that has recorded growth is the agricultural sector, and the industrial sectors like mining, construction, mining and construction in particular have really been hard hit by as much as 75%. It's perhaps not surprising because in fact South Africa implemented one of the world's strictest lockdowns. For those of you who are currently in lockdown in Melbourne, I think it was actually harsher in South Africa. We weren't allowed to even go outside to exercise. And so that's obviously had a big hit on the economy, which will have flow-on impacts for unemployment and government debt, which were already tracking up. And South Africa being the continent's most industrialised economy, we're going to see that this is going to have spillover impacts beyond its borders. A technical bounce back is expected in the third quarter, and everyone's looking ahead to the medium-term budget statement by the government in October. But I think it will still be a very, very tough business environment, at least in the short to medium term. The better news is that South Africa's COVID-19 trajectory is improving, although we're not out of the woods yet. Active cases are now about 1/3 of what they were at the peak of the epidemic here. in late July, and they continue to decline. So far, the lifting of almost all restrictions on economic activity from mid-August has not, fingers crossed, triggered a second wave, although this remains an issue to watch. Politically, I think South Africa, it's fair to say, remains in a difficult position. There's been a wave of scandals surrounding COVID-19 procurement tenders, which has damaged the ANC government's credibility and President Ramaphosa's own personal authority. He's acted recently to reassert his authority by getting the party to publicly support tougher measures against corruption. But at the end of the day, what people want to see here are arrests or successful prosecutions of high-profile individuals linked to corruption. There is, however, progress being made to rebuild South Africa's institutions, such as the National Prosecuting Authority, which were really hollowed out over the decade of state capture under former President Zuma. And there've been appointment of competent people to key posts in a range of government bodies and state-owned enterprises, but progress will be slow, continue to be slow and incremental. And I think incrementalism is what we can expect in most areas where there are long-standing policy challenges, whether it's the chronic power cuts and blackouts, which are known here as load shedding, uneven or poor service delivery at the local government level, and the need for structural reform, which is often frustrating for people wanting to do business and invest in South Africa. The crisis has, if anything, underscored and accelerated the need for economic reform here. There's a lot of talk about it. There's a lot of good plans on paper, but implementation has yet to be seen. And time is of the essence. But at the same time, South Africa continues to maintain, some world-class fundamentals. I think the Johannesburg Stock Exchange is one of them. It's the world's 19th largest stock exchange by market capitalisation. There's very deep liquidity here in South Africa's financial markets. I think it has probably a more developed corporate bond market than Australia. It's got a stable banking sector. It remains a hub for corporate Africa, which may be reinforced once the African Continental Free Trade Area is implemented, and we'll hear more about that from my colleague Peter Doyle in Addis shortly. And also, South Africa has a very resilient and dynamic private sector, which is a real reservoir of expertise and skills, policy innovation and ideas. And what we've seen during the COVID crisis is private sector come together under an umbrella organisation known as Business for South Africa, which has offered its support and ideas and very detailed economic recovery plans for government to draw on to support capacity constraints in the public sector. So I might just leave it at that, but to sum up, I think that it's a substantial, diversified economic relationship between our two countries. There's certainly potential for stronger partnerships and growth opportunities, but we also need to be clear-eyed that these are very challenging times. I think now more than ever, it's important for government and business to work together to look to grow our economic relationship, and I'm certainly committed to doing that. So please reach out to us if you have specific issues or if you have ideas on how we can work better together. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Her Excellency. That was some wonderful insights, and we will have the opportunity to ask some questions after we've got the next two speakers. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce His Excellency Mr. Peter Doyle. And Peter is the ambassador in Ethiopia. Peter's had a long career as a diplomat. Most recently, he was the Chargé d'Affaires for the Australian Embassy in Brazil, and he arrived in post in January 2019. So it's a great pleasure that we welcome His Excellency Peter Doyle to say a few words. Thanks, Peter.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much, Ian. And thank you very much, Duncan, and to your colleagues at the Australia-Africa Chamber of Commerce for this invitation to be with you this morning. I'd like to start. My screen has changed, and I've got somebody's wedding photo, I think. So hopefully you can see and hear me. I wanted to start by just sort of asking you to reflect on what you think about when you hear the word Ethiopia, because I'm guessing it's not commerce, it's not business opportunity. So maybe you think about coffee. Maybe you think about Haile Gebrselassie and his win at the Sydney Olympics. Maybe you even think famine. A surprising number of people still do, and that dates you. It shows you were paying attention in the 1980s. Maybe you think that you recall that Ethiopia is the only country in Africa that was not colonized. It was occupied but not colonized. Or maybe you even think of the GERD that these days, which is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So the last one might lead you to think about commerce a bit, but most of the others, not so much. So I'm reflecting on the order in which we're speaking today, and I'm going to be a little bit disappointing after Geeta, who gave such an overview, I think, about the extent of the commercial relationship between South Africa and Australia. Ethiopia, it's more in prospect than current reality. So, but we'll make a couple of points about a potentially brighter future than the current reality, perhaps. Normally in these sort of forums, I invite people to tell me what they want me to talk about, but in Zoom times, of course, that doesn't really work so well. So I'll make a few points, but I'll try not to talk too long because I would like to leave a bit more time for discussion and questions. Also, I'm not going to go through stats. So I'm like me, I'm sure you're even better at internet research, and you can look at the World Bank and the IMF and the UN, and you can put together your own economic stats package should you wish to. What I'd rather like to do is give you a little bit of a flavour of what's going on here and what's in prospect, I think. And if there's a bit of time at the end, yes, we might talk a little bit about the Africa Comprehensive Free Trade Area Agreement, which is now technically in force. Right, so a couple of the key messages that perhaps I'll just run through a couple of dot points, and then perhaps if there's time and interest, we can go back over, I'll go back over them in a little bit more detail. The first one is, and here it's a sort of more positive story than South Africa. This is a high growth economy. So in pre-COVID, it was for 10 years up until about 2018, it averaged over 9%, closer to 10%. So it puts Ethiopia in basically the China range of growth in recent decades. It started to fall off a little bit, and then it will fall off again, of course, in the current year to maybe 3 point something, and then the projections are that it will bounce back a little bit next year. So despite COVID, it's still expected to be a growth economy. A lot of that growth was driven by infrastructure investment, and that's now, there's less of that now, and there maybe will be a little bit less of that in the future. Second major point is that Ethiopia is in transition. So both politically and economically. This is, for any of you who are at all familiar with Ethiopian history, you know, the 20th century was not particularly kind, nor was it conducive to economic growth and reducing people from poverty until right towards the end of the 20th century. Now it wants to move towards being a real democracy, something that hasn't happened before, and it wants to move to be a much more open, well-structured economy. Again, apart from the last 10 years of infrastructure-led growth, that hasn't really happened either. So it's an extremely ambitious agenda, which started when Prime Minister Abiy took over the prime ministership in April 2018. And he has this extremely ambitious political and economic reform agenda, which will, if successful, and we hope it will be, of course, will deliver enormous gains and enormous potential for Ethiopia to engage commercially more with the world. Next major point, it's not a market for the faint-hearted, nor for those who want to go it alone. So it's, you know, Ethiopia remains a least developed country, and it has very little experience of open markets. It's trying to get there quickly, but you know, it's, as in any sort of transition process, it's can be a little bit murky, challenging, and difficult at times, and that's where we are at the moment. Next main point, but there are opportunities. So mining, of course, is the big one, as it is in many countries on the continent from an Australian perspective. But it's still trying to develop the framework to regulate a modern mining industry. It's really committed to trying to do that. And so there's been several iterations of trying to put the legislative and regulatory framework in place to attract the investment that it needs into mining. Particularly gold mining is the one that's getting a lot of interest, but there's also potash deposits, tantalum, and many other opportunities. The next point is Ethiopia is desperate for FDI. So it doesn't have its, well, like Australia, we don't generate enough capital to fund the growth that we want. Ethiopia is exactly the same. So it's really keen on attracting FDI. It wants a very broad range of companies from different countries to take an interest. Incidentally, all of the big players are here. So it gets a lot of attention from the US, from China, from the big Europeans, but also from countries such as Turkey and India, who are invested here in quite substantial ways. The macro and then crossing over into the business environment. Foreign exchange is always an issue here. The government doesn't really have the reserves that it needs, and so access to foreign currency is often can be a little bit problematic. Another challenge is IT. I mean, Geeta mentioned about load shedding, so access to power and regular and reliable power and IT is problematic here. Actually, I didn't hear quite a bit of your talk, Ian and Geeta, since we're trying to reconnect. So that's a sort of perpetual difficulty here. On the security environment, which people might sort of occasionally see mention of Ethiopia in a not so positive way in the news. Look, yes, there are and there will continue to be security challenges in many parts of the country, and that's maybe ticked up a bit since this transition process got underway. But I can maybe talk about that a little bit more if there's real interest when we get to the Q&A. Maybe I'll just finish with a point about the Free Trade Area Agreement. So this came into effect last year rather, when a sufficient number of countries ratified the agreement. It's extremely ambitious. It's bringing all of the economies on the continent together. And the idea is laudable and extremely ambitious. The implementation is going to be challenging. Well, it would have been pre-COVID. It's now even challenging in COVID times. And things have been, of course, going a little bit more slower, as you would expect. And unlike the way that we do FTAs, this FTA, it's, if you like, agreed in principle, and then negotiations continue about a lot of the practicalities of implementation. So although it exists in legal reality, in actual trading reality, it not yet. So a lot of things need to be worked out before Africa approaches anything like a single market. But as like with Ethiopia's reform program, a high degree of ambition and good chances of success, but it'll be a little bit rocky on the road there, I think. I might leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Your Excellency. That was a very useful commentary in regards to Ethiopia, and I think you're quite right in opening up and saying what do people think about Ethiopia from their own perspective. So thank you very much for those words. I'd now like to introduce our third High Commissioner today, and that's Her Excellency Miss Alison Chartres. Alison has been in post since 2017. She's just about due to finish her posting and has done a fabulous job in Kenya, has been a career diplomat, worked in a number of posts around the world. Her most recent role back in Canberra before going to Nairobi was Assistant Secretary in the Development Policy and Education branch. and she has, I think, really enjoyed her time in Nairobi. And thank you very much, Alison, for joining us today, and we look forward to your commentary about Kenya. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Ian, Duncan, and everyone involved in bringing this webinar together, and good afternoon and good morning to everyone online. Yes, I very much enjoyed my 3 years here in Kenya, and of course covering other countries of this part of East Africa. It's been a pleasure. There's been some ups and downs along the way, of course, and we're all experiencing that in 2020, but I'm excited about the prospects for countries across Africa, and of course very excited about what I've witnessed here over the last 3 years, and to really see some of those really strong Australian ties just grow even deeper. So I wanted just in my sort of brief comments today just to provide a bit of an overview, and then I'll also sort of drill into some of those sectors and then some of the challenges like Peter and Geeta have done as well. So, and I think this really is an opportunity for Australian business to diversify, and we're all great proponents of that diversification sort of happening here on the African continent. There is such untapped potential here for Australian companies. It's not a perfect environment here in Kenya or in neighbouring countries by any means, but there's certainly Australian businesses and companies that are doing very well here. Some continue to navigate through the challenges of operating in East Africa, but if you've got the will and the patience and the will to link up with partners here, then there's great opportunity. A few of the sort of key things behind that, I think, are the strong people-to-people linkages, and I think sometimes we don't always appreciate how deep they really are. In education, Kenya, if we look at the African students in Australia, Kenyans make up the largest share of those international students from the African continent. And that means that there's a whole lot of wonderful Kenyans back here, and Tanzanians and others who have had experience studying in Australia, understand quite a bit about Australia from their time there, and are really ready and willing to support Australian companies. So I really wanted to make sure that we highlighted the alumni here as well as being really a great resource for companies to tap into. Obviously, language, Kenya's a country, English is obviously widely spoken, and language of government and business. So there's a curiosity and a fondness for Australia here. We have a reputation for quality and ethical and good business. We don't have a big business community here, but the community we do have here in other parts of East Africa really have a very, very good and credible reputation. So there is definitely appetite for more Australian investment here. Some of you will know the biggest mine in Kenya is an Australian-owned mine. It's Base Titanium, which is the subsidiary of Base Resources in Perth. Mineral Sands, I think it's a terrific example again of a company that has found an opportunity here and is doing excellent work and excellent shared value as well as part of their mining interests here. There's others. Geeta mentioned Worley. Worley has also had some considerable success here with business in Kenya. WindLab as well is active in this region. We've got numerous education agents here, of course, selling the virtues of Australian education, and the distributors of many Australian products. And we're really pleased to see that interest in food and beverage also grow with the growing middle class, particularly in more disposable income, notwithstanding the pressures obviously on everyone with COVID-19. Some of the sectors have already been mentioned, and they're just as relevant for this part of the African continent. Of course, mining extractives, I've mentioned Base. There are at least 21 Australian extractive companies that we know about here in Kenya, Tanzania and Uganda. Obviously quite a few are in Tanzania. It's very rich in mineral deposits. Kenya's also looking to grow its mining sector and have that contribute more to GDP. There's opportunities here in gold, rare earths, graphite, nickel, copper and cobalt, just to name a few, as well as, of course, mineral sands. The oil sector is sort of a nascent industry here and in Uganda, but may provide opportunities, and Worley certainly has benefited from some of those opportunities in the recent years. Renewable energy, huge appetite, as other colleagues have mentioned online today. Kenya ranked the world's 8th largest geothermal powerhouse in the world last year. It wants to be powered entirely by green energy by 2022. So there are huge opportunities for Australian investment in renewable energy coming forth, and also in the industries around that. And again, Worley is a good example of a company that's benefited from that. Agribusiness, food security, a huge issue still for every country here on the continent of Africa. There's some Australians doing amazing work here, including in Kenya. Ausquest, Stuart Barden runs a farm just out of Nairobi, and is really bringing an innovation to farming techniques that is just being absorbed with no end of appetite here in Kenya, to see how he can produce amazing agriculture on black cotton soil. And it's just an example of Australian ingenuity and innovation, and he's very ready and willing to share his insights into that sector here. There's also, of course, water harvesting, flood mitigation, all of the challenges that Australia faces, Kenya and other countries in this region face too, and they often ask us about Australian expertise. So if companies are in that space, there's some interesting future opportunities. We've talked about education, medical technology, food and beverage as well. I think for all of us, with the experience of this year and COVID-19, there is a real need for companies to bring in innovation and technology. I think virtual learning, medical technology, telehealth, these are all really important opportunities that are only going to grow as we've experienced now. East Africa, we've got some gateways to the Middle East as well, so I don't want to forget the connections there. There's a lot of Australian companies obviously operating in the Middle East. We have big ports here with Mombasa and Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. There's some real opportunities there for greater linkages for Australian companies also operating in the Middle East. Just very quickly on some of the challenges, because I know we're tight for time. Obviously, like everybody else has mentioned, COVID-19 has impacted Kenya and other countries in this region. There is still some positive growth forecast, but obviously it's taken a hit. So there is slow recovery. We haven't been in a tight lockdown here as we have in some other countries. The government's really been trying to balance that, the public health concerns, obviously, with keeping the economy running, and it's really important for employment. There are some uncertainties in the regulatory environment, which we continue to work through as the Australian government, with the Kenyan government, the Tanzanian government and others. So they present challenges which we can always, of course, work with companies and provide you with more advice on that. Access to financing, not easy, particularly for some sectors. So again, we can provide further information on that. And the lack of intelligent data and credible information is something that also is a gap here for both business and government, of course. And but interestingly, some Australian interest in actually helping in that space. There's a lot of work going on ending anti-corruption and improvements to the ease of doing business. Slow steps, but important steps are being made in that space. So, decision-making power can be fairly concentrated, of course, but there's some really, really positive movement in Kenya and elsewhere on governance more broadly, which is really good news for business. Look, I might just conclude with those comments. The opportunities are still very, very strong here and numerous. And I do encourage businesses to consider coming into this region. But like my other colleagues have said, it requires your eyes to be wide open, draw on the experience and the insights that we can all provide through the Australian government agencies, Austrade and areas of DFAT. And of course, we can provide excellent linkages on the ground as well. So thank you, I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you, Your Excellencies, for your wide-ranging and indeed insightful presentations. This is, of course, now the opportunity for our audience to put questions to our various High Commissioners and Ambassadors. And to that extent, I'd like to introduce you to Boban Tomic. Boban is our Head of Strategy at the AACC, and I'm sure that noting the number of questions coming up through the chat there, Boban, you've got lots to put through. So please, over to Boban.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Duncan, and thank you to all and to our esteemed guests as well and participants. We do have quite a few questions. I guess just from my point of view, whilst there are challenges, the growth opportunities are huge. And when you look at the fact that you've got 220 million people in the 4 markets that we're talking about, including Australia, of course, and a GDP, an aggregate GDP of Ethiopia, South Africa, Kenya, and Australia of $2 trillion US, certainly there's a lot of opportunities in there. So, and as Ian mentioned earlier, right at the start, it's critical that we harness the knowledge, and that's why we're here, so we can share and exchange information, and that's what the Q&A session is for. I have one question, Ian, at a more macro level. I was hoping you could help me with that one, which is obviously there are some, and it's very topical, tensions with China at the moment. And how does Australia see Africa in terms of the balance of international trade?
It's a good question, Bob. We are seeing certainly a number of clients coming into the whole MEA Africa region. And to Alison's point, there are certainly some companies that we're certainly talking to at the moment that may have positioned themselves in the UAE to begin with, then expanded across the GCC, now looking at sub-Saharan Africa. And so, and then the Austrade team in Africa themselves have also had a number of clients reach out to them to say, look, we'd like to consider Africa. So, and it is about diversification. I think there is certainly some concern. You know, also from a broad general trade perspective, COVID has given a lot of companies a big knock. And so they are looking to now diversify their business model. And as we've all sort of been saying, we've got a lot of presence, a lot of resource across Africa, got a lot of insights, and a lot of people can help companies expand into Africa if they're interested in it, and across a range of sectors. And I think the ambassadors and high commissioners really amplified it very well on the sorts of sectors that we're working across and the types of companies that are showing interest in Africa.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Before I move on to our other participants, there is one more in relation to the Pan-African rail network within the scope of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. Do we have any new news around that, the progress of that particular project? Hello, Ian. Yep.
I'm not across the detail on that one, sorry, Bob. And maybe one of the high commissioners or ambassadors are across that.
Certainly, we can follow up on that one. Yeah, we can follow up on that one because obviously the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement is quite broad in its scope, so we can get back to that question. The next question I have is for Her Excellency Ms. Geeta Kamath, Australia's High Commissioner to South Africa. Hi, Geeta, thank you. Obviously, you mentioned it's a very balanced relationship between Australia and South Africa, and Australia is quite a top, well, you said number 7, I think, but investor in terms of FDI into South Africa. But where do you see the future emerging opportunities from Australia to South Africa and the other way around? Where is the win-win scenario as you see it?
Well, obviously mining is at the heart of it, and that will continue because of the expertise both in Australia and in South Africa. So there's real complementarities there. But I think one growth area, and it's been amplified by COVID, it will be on e-commerce and digital trade. I think, you know, we've all had to become very digitally savvy ourselves, but it's really opened up, I think, opportunities to utilise the digital economy to continue business operations. And an example I have of that is education and how that will, what that will mean, not just in South Africa, but across Africa more broadly. And I think it's going to be very disruptive here and transformative, the moving into the digital space. And a good example of that, we have an Australian company that has a base here in South Africa called Idea Digital Education, which created a virtual school solution for government departments, including providing digital curricula to governments and education providers in Africa. And it was actually awarded the UNECA, that is the UN Economic Commission for Africa Award for Best Innovation in Government, for government in response to COVID in June. So I think that's a real potential area. We have also seen in South Africa, when we're talking about economic reform, one thing the government has been promising is to have spectrum licensing via auction for 5G. It's been sort of kicked down the road a bit longer now till the first quarter of next year, but I think that will be very transformative when it happens, because it will certainly bring down the high costs of data here, and that will help to facilitate this growth in e-commerce and digital trade. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I can imagine with the enormous intellectual capacities in both markets, that will be accelerated post-COVID quite robustly. The next question I have for His Excellency, Mr. Peter Doyle, Australia's Ambassador to Ethiopia. Thank you for your feedback in relation to Ethiopia. We know it's a very large market, fast-growing, emerging market, and there are obviously plenty of opportunities and challenges, one of which is the high inflation rate. But in terms of the opportunities, where do you see them? Is it in the private sector investment area, or is it in capacity building, hydro? Where do you see the opportunities for Australian businesses in Ethiopia? And reversely, beyond coffee, in Australia, where do you see the opportunities for Ethiopian businesses?
I think I mentioned mining. I mean, I think it's where a lot of Australians start when they think about the continent, and that's where most of the incipient interest is. There are a number of Australian interests, and also like UK-based companies, but with Australian management, who that's where they're looking at. And Ethiopia is not yet, as I said, developed a modern mining regulatory environment, but there are Australian companies who are trying to assist with that. And so that's definitely the most prospective sector, mining, and within mining, gold. You mentioned hydro, which is interesting. So I mentioned in a slightly throwaway sense at the start, the grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. But hydro and renewables is another area of considerable potential. The other one that we often talk about, and I think Ian mentioned this, but as I say, I didn't catch all of his introductory remarks. Agriculture is another one. It's sort of obvious in a way. If you look at Ethiopia and you look at lots of parts of Australia, you see huge similarities in the environment. So, and Ethiopia really does want to develop its agriculture sector. Difficulty there is, of course, well, there are a number. But perhaps the main one is that it's been such a subsistence agricultural society for so long, and land is a very sensitive issue. So there are going to be difficulties there, but I think there has been really some significant improvements in agricultural productivity, and I think so that there's opportunities for Australian companies there, maybe in beef in particular, in the lowlands, and then all sorts of grains and so on in the highlands. Mm-hmm. On Ethiopia into Australia, I think Ethiopia is not a huge foreign investor. I mean, it's as I said, it doesn't have a surplus of capital, and its efforts are overwhelmingly on developing its own economy. So I think that's a little bit further down the track.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that. And obviously with Ethiopia, I think post-COVID moving to $100 billion US plus economy, there'll be plenty of opportunity there for local enterprises as well as Australian enterprises. Okay, moving on. Yeah, thank you. Moving on, question for Her Excellency, Ms. Alison Chatra, High Commissioner to Kenya. You spoke a lot about the Australian opportunities in Kenya, which is quite broad-based, from mining to, I believe, some new emerging areas. And the other, I mean, which I think you've covered quite well, the other part of the equation really relates to a very topical and significant sector within Kenya, which is, of course, the horticultural and agricultural opportunities. And I know we've had some direct questioning on that. How do you see that evolving in terms of Kenyan benefit exporting those sectors to Australia, where Australia is not already strong, of course?
Thank you for that. Yes, and it's a question over the time I've been in this role. I've been approached a number of times from Kenyan sort of producers, horticultural producers and associations, sort of really seeing Australia as another market. Obviously, traditionally, Kenya has looked to Europe for its exports, but Australia often comes up in conversation. Look, I think, I think there's still some areas to explore there. Obviously, cut flowers, I had no idea until I started in this role, just how many of our cut flowers in Australia come from Kenya. It's really deepened mine and my deputy's appreciation as we've been dealing with importers in Australia of cut flowers here. That hasn't been without its challenges, of course, because of our very strong quarantine rules. And I think that's an ongoing issue for any sort of horticultural exports from here to Australia. Our biosecurity standards are obviously necessarily very strong and very strict, and we've seen some of the challenges that's presented to the flower industry here in terms of having to achieve that high standard. I really hope that there will be some opportunities here, especially in Kenya, for producers here to be able to achieve our high standards in terms of pest control and fumigation. And I hope then that may open up some other opportunities in horticulture. But it's not one that I can emphasize as a sort of strong area of growth, because I think, as you say, we have a lot of our own fresh produce in Australia, and we have very tough quarantine rules. So that's sort of not a sector that I see is going to immediately provide a growth opportunity.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. We have a number of questions that have come in the last minute or so, which I haven't had an opportunity to collate and forward. But as always, we guarantee to those interested parties that we will forward them to the appropriate area and answer them ahead of any other get-together. So that's it for the Q&A. Thank you very much to all the participants for answering the questions very thoroughly. Appreciate it. Back to you, Duncan. Duncan, if you can just unmute, please.
I do apologise, one and all. I was just being diligent in keeping offline. Can I just then conclude by thanking the ambassadors and high commissioners for their presentations and the responses, and of course to Ian and his team at Austrade. Just two matters if we can finish. Firstly, just to remind you that we have another Heads of Mission webinar this same time next week, and that invitation to that will be going out from our time tomorrow morning, first sharp tomorrow morning to everybody. So we very much look forward to you joining with us to hear from 4 more of our diplomats based in Africa next week. I might also like to conclude, as I do, by asking all of you who are enjoying viewing this webinar perhaps to go to the AACC website, hit that tab which is called membership, and think about joining us, because quite frankly, we'd like to think that to the extent that you can help us, we can help you. So on that note, I thank you all for joining us today. It's really been more than stimulating, and we look forward to this in an ongoing way. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks everyone. Did well. Good job, Alison and Geeta and Peter. Well done. Thanks, Duncan. Another good job.
Thank you to our respective. I can assure you, Alison, Geeta, Peter, I'll be back in touch with you very shortly.
Okay. And sorry, Bob, the question on railways that you had. Sorry, I missed some of your question. Maybe I could have helped. Oh, you're on mute.
You're on mute, David.
Yep, sorry. We can follow up that post this session. It was in relation to the Pan-African Rail Network within the context of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is a broad agreement. So there's a lot there to cover. So we can cover that next time maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. I mean, there's obviously a lot going on in the railways here in East Africa too. So we'll talk about that.
Thank you very much.
It's very interesting, one and all, because the issue of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is we have a partner there in London called Invest Africa, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And in about an hour and a half's time, they're running a special webinar on that very topic. So it's really coming forward, despite and I noticed Peter's interesting comments about it's been agreed in principle, there's a lot to be worked through, but there is what I use an expression to describe as a new scramble for Africa, isn't there, with the majors all coming in to have a look to see what this is all about.
I think that's right, Duncan. Yep.
Okay.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Well done,
Thank you
everybody.
very much for your
Great day,
thoughtful
everybody.
comments. Much
Bye-bye.
appreciated. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Bye.